Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether we should take a poll as to whether you are in a shocked state of awe or an awed state of shock. But let me just ask the following favors. If you look around, there are quite a number of people here. So could I ask you, when I call on you, to first give your name and your affiliation, and second, ask one question ending in a question mark without more than a few parts. We have a very good set of steps in front of the building if you do want to give a speech, but just for the moment, let's concentrate on the questions. And who would like to begin? The gentleman in the second row.
I think there's a mic behind you.
Yes, my name is Greg Aftandilian. I'm an independent consultant. My question deals with the bar graph for young people being influenced by Arab policies. You know, since this was taken, the poll in December of 2010, and given the fact that all this stuff in the Arab world happened in January, February, is it your hunch that that is a low number now? I mean, just because of social media and the fact that Yemeni young people may be influenced by what's happening among young people in the rest of the Arab world? Thank you.
Well, certainly we did see that it's a more impressionable population. And therefore, even with its self-expressed disinterest in results, in activities beyond the local, it's one that is certainly more open to influence than their elders. Social media seems to have very low penetration in Yemen, given its poor and rural state. I think the number of Yemenis who reported even weekly access to the internet, as I recall, was 5% or so, certainly in the low single digits. I think the multiplier effect of social media through word of mouth may be more profound than that. But it is a country, I think, clearly in which influence is going to be most exerted at the local level through local opinion leaders, family, associates, religious leaders. And I think that that's the main route of communication throughout the country. Again, our results are from December. The revolution is, started months later. We can see some of the disaffection beyond it. But I think we have to, while this is a regional phenomenon, and quite a striking one, of course, I think it is idiosyncratic in each country in terms of its development and course, and I think we can see that in Yemen as well. It's not a movement, while it may have been sparked by recognition of what's going on in the rest of the region, I think that must be seen as fundamentally indigenous. And I think that's probably true of all of these. Yeah.
Let's see, the gentleman in the back row.
Anshuman Apte from Voice of America TV Ashna, that is Afghanistan service. I would request you to kind of sum up all the presentation, like the data that you just presented, by looking at the audience. And have you deducted any recommendations? And if you could elaborate, if you have any recommendations.
Who let the TV producer in here?
I think that's an interview, not a question. Would you care to pin it down just a little?
Yeah. So if you could like elaborate on the findings in terms of negotiations with Taliban,
yeah.
Support for the U.S. mission over there.
So your interest specifically is in Afghanistan and not in the Yemen results?
No, not Yemen. Okay. Just specifically focusing on Afghanistan.
That makes it a little easier, thanks.
Sure,
so what we found, as you can see, fundamentally what we found in Afghanistan is a result in which the areas in which the United States and its NATO allies have been making their most concerted effort, they've achieved success. But in a phenomenon not unlike squeezing a balloon, you've seen Taliban activity and discontent bubble up elsewhere in the rest of the country, raising the question of what do we do in the other 30-plus provinces of Afghanistan. It's a real challenge, I think, for the military and for policymakers alike. With an enormous concerted effort of military and development aid, you can have an impact in a province or in two provinces. But there are many more provinces than that in the country. How you get it all under control is a real challenge, and I think that that's the clearest result or question raised by these data.
Just one follow-up, if I may. Have you recommended anything, like, is this study that you guys conducted, are there any recommendations as to how to correct this situation?
It'd be a little outside of my brief. I think our effort, very frankly, I think there are agencies and individuals in the government who have access to their own data and can see these results and make their conclusions. Our purpose in doing particularly the Afghanistan survey for our media clients is to share this intelligence with the population more broadly here in the United States and worldwide, frankly, so we can share in the understanding and judgments that our policymakers are approaching. It would be outside my pay grade to make any suggestions about the way forward, but I think in picking apart the course of public attitudes in the country and seeing their correlation with events on the ground really does inform our judgment as citizens in an essential way.
The lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Mia Benarski from the National Democratic Institute, and I was hoping you could talk a little more about capacity on the ground in Yemen. This being the first survey, do you feel that the no opinion or the do not know responses were higher because you're building capacity? And especially for women interviewers, do you think that may have influenced your numbers at all?
So interviewers did go out in male and female teams. The women interviewers are escorted by males, but the interviews of women are conducted by women. It's the same methodology we've used in Iraq and used in Afghanistan. All I can tell you is that the difference we've seen, the unwillingness to express an opinion that we saw among women in Yemen, since it's not reflected in the expressions of attitudes by men, indicates obviously a difference, and also is not an experience that we had either in our Iraq or Afghanistan pollings. We don't see in those surveys a difference between the willingness of men and women to express an opinion. So it was a surprise to me in the result. It does seem to be a real socio-cultural phenomenon in Yemen, and it's one to think about. If you want to develop a strategy to understand and address the concerns of women in Yemen, it's going to take some real hard thinking given these results.
So the gentleman in the second row there.
Colonel Datta, President of Indian Veteran Officers Association. I have lots of kith and kin who served in Afghanistan. Even present service is being rendered in Afghanistan, some of my kith and kin. The question is, after summing up the entire survey, and that too in opinion of President Karzai, that Taliban's are the part of the Afghan society. So under these circumstances, when there is a withdrawal by the major forces, by superpower, there is a vacuum left. What is your survey, our findings, that when the vacuum would be left, how smooth the withdrawal will be, and what would be the repercussions on the local population? So far as the government or governance is concerned.
Yeah, it's challenging to answer that because it's difficult to poll for hypotheticals. We say to respondents, suppose X happens, what do you think of Y? It's supposition. We tend to try to measure harder sentiment about current conditions, current attitudes about what's occurring in the country. So I don't know if I have direct data on that for you. Certainly we know that Afghans are war-weary, are deeply influenced and concerned by both the extent of continued violence in their country and the slow pace of development and economic opportunity in the country. And that's led to increased frustrations. Now, there's been up and downs in the ratings of the performance as there's been an ebb and flow in the delivery of development aid and in the prevention of violence, or particularly of violence attributed to Western forces. So there are levers that can move these attitudes. But fundamentally, the overall path, as you can see from the beginning, has not been a good one, given the length and the difficulties involved in the long now Western involvement in this country. It's difficult to predict where it goes in the future, but there are real significant challenges here. What we've seen in Helmand and Kandahar, attitudinally and in terms of experience, it is possible to have a major effect and influence. But how do you extend that to work across this country is, again, the most basic challenge that these data suggest.
I think I should just note that first, there is no agreement within the U.S. government as to what our goals are for withdrawal this year as yet. The 2014 deadline has been publicly described as aspirational, a phrase I find difficult to understand, and that if you look carefully at the PowerPoints that are being issued by the government, there is now an arrow beyond 2014 which goes on to 2025, although they do not put the date down. So since no American knows what withdrawal means, it may be hard to poll the Afghans on what the impact of our non-plan is.
I would just add to that, it's a great point that in our U.S. data, you know, we find the public support for the war in Afghanistan at a new low in our latest survey research for ABC News. That a broad, I don't have the numbers with me, but a broad majority of Americans want the United States to remove its forces from Afghanistan this summer, and a small minority of Americans think it will. The irony politically of all this, because absent the bad economy, hell hath no fury politically like an unpopular war, is that it's conceivable that President Obama could survive this election only to be done in by the war in Afghanistan.
That's it. The lady in the back there.
Chance, Counterpart International. How would you explain a drop in acceptance of women's rights from 2009 to 2010?
Okay,
I would naively think that once you get someone on board that women have roughly the same rights, they'll stay there. So why the drop?
Yeah, so I didn't explain that clearly enough. It's not an acceptance of women's rights, it's a rating of the condition of women's rights. You think the treatment or the rights of women in this area are in good condition or in poor condition, and the drop we saw was in the rating of the delivery of women's rights, if you will. And as I showed in the data, women's rights were rated increasingly negative, in particular in areas where we had increased Taliban activity.
See, the lady in the second row there.
Thank you. Lauren Serpy with International Foundation for Electoral Systems. I know you said you would have liked to ask more questions on corruption. I'm curious if you did ask a couple more, if you could elaborate on them. And if not, what would you like to ask in the future regarding corruption?
I'm not sure that we have to be really sensitive to the terms we use and the explanations we offer in terms of measuring things like corruption. And I'd like to see some data, which I don't have in this survey, that delves more into what Afghans themselves regard as corruption as opposed to the normal course of business in the country. And I think that that would help us understand it better. We see that corruption is highly rated as an irritant, and as a supposed reason for support for the Taliban. But when you ask people the country's greatest problems, corruption is far lower on the list. Now, that may be because of the extent of the other challenges in terms of security and the economy and development needs as well. But I don't know that we've truly encircled what corruption means to Afghans in their daily lives, and that's where I'd like to see more work.
Gary, if I may follow up, one thing that struck me about both your poll and what we've seen in Iraq is that the police, if you ask about the police as an institution, tend to be surprisingly favorable. But in some other polls I've seen, when you ask what your experience is with the police, they are almost uniformly extraordinarily negative. And that, to some extent, may be explained by another question your poll didn't address, which is perception of the courts, which in both countries is considerably more negative than perceptions of the police. In other words, people really see the court itself as more of a problem than the police. So I wonder if you have looked at at this kind of issue, because I'm a little surprised at the disconnect we perpetually see between institutional popularity and experience with the same institutions.
Yeah, in fact, although I didn't bring the data with me, my firm wrote an extensive analysis of data in a survey specifically of policing in Afghanistan we did for the United Nations Development Program several months ago. The results are up on my website, and if anyone wants, I can show you to it. You can read the full report, which runs about 80 pages. It's an extensive survey of attitudes toward the police. Experientially, there are some positives and some negatives. It's a bit of a mix, but certainly we see that the police's association with the court system, which is very broadly seen as problematic and indeed corrupt, is a negative factor in overall views. There's no question about it.
The gentleman on the first row.
My name is Abdurrahman Al-Iryani from the Yemeni embassy. First of all, I'd like to really thank you for presenting us with some important data, which includes the favorability of our president. And it is accurate, to be honest, 80%, despite people's being unhappy with our government and the services provided by our government. I noticed that there is a division between the south and north. I just wanted to know, I think you visited Yemen, right?
I have not personally, no.
Oh, okay. Because I wanted to know if there was a data involving if the southern people, the people of the south of Yemen mistrust the north of Yemen and how their relations among each other. I just wanted to know if you have this kind of data.
Yeah, so in addition to the far lower ratings for the president in the south of the country, we saw, in an associated sense, the disaffection index I showed you, which is vastly higher in the south. And I think, knowing the history of the country, these data shouldn't be a surprise. But there is vastly higher disaffection or distrust of the government, a vastly higher sense that it's performing poorly, that it's not responding to the will or interest of the population, and suspicion of government activities. Also, particularly in the south, there's a considerably lower sense of security. And all those, and I think those support the difference we saw in ratings of the president.
I'm Tally Cross from Occidental Petroleum, and I just had a question about your stats for women on religiosity. 88% for women and 55% for men. That's over a 30-point difference. Can you explain that, and is that sort of a regional trend, or is that particular to Yemen?
That religiosity question is one I haven't asked elsewhere, so I don't have cross-national data to evaluate it. It is an interesting difference, I agree. Also, because women, of course, maybe not of course, but women are almost uniformly likely not to report attending mosque. So it's a home-based religion, of course, that they're expressing their devotion to, but it is a difference, a significant one, at a very high level. But again, it's an insular society, very locally focused, and the female population is particularly interesting in their disengagement from life outside, it seems, home and religion. Yeah.
I noticed the 73% you had for support for negotiations, and that broke down when you sort of explored the negotiating framework. Did you find similar variances when you broke down between urban and rural divides or provincial breakdowns?
Yeah, we didn't see dramatic differences in those results. I think there may have been across province levels. I'll have to pull that data up, and I'll be happy to follow up with you to do it. But none dramatic enough for me to pull out in a separate slide. I think overall, the message we saw across provinces, as well as other groups, urban, rural, was support for negotiations. Majority support of those, a little bit lower for a negotiated settlement, but far lower support for negotiated settlement that ceded control to the Taliban, given their very broad unpopularity in the country. That's really the takeaway there.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you very much. I think we've given Gary quite a run. And we will have these results up on the CSIS website. We also will have a video of the actual speech and presentation. But let's thank Gary and the Indian